The bet was not made in anger. That was the thing people misunderstood later when the story circulated and the edges got filed down the way edges always do when a story passes through enough rooms. It was made the way Mick Jagger made most pronouncements in private, with the casual authority of someone who had been right about the music industry for so long that being right had stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a reflex. It was the autumn of 1991. London. A dinner at a private members club in Mayfair, maybe 30 people. Record executives, musicians at the tier of fame that had moved past needing to be seen and into the territory of simply being. Mick Jagger was 48. The Rolling Stones had just completed the Steel Wheels tour. He had survived punk, disco, the 80s, his own solo career. He was not a man who worried about the future of rock music. The conversation turned to Nirvana sometime after the main course. Nevermind had been released 3 weeks earlier. "A year," said someone at the far end of the table. "2 at the most." Mick Jagger set down his wine glass. "I'll take that bet. 2 years. The music press will move on, the audience will move on, and he'll either make a proper record or disappear. That's how this works." 10,000, Mick Jagger said. 2 years. The bet was placed. The conversation moved on. Nobody at that table had met Kurt Cobain. The first time Mick Jagger saw Kurt in person was not arranged. It was March 1992 at a music industry event in Los Angeles. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating these spaces since before most of the people in it were born. Kurt was standing near a wall, slightly apart from the group he had arrived with. T-shirt cut at the sleeves, jeans that hadn't been washed recently. Holding a drink he wasn't drinking, looking at the room with the expression of someone who was somewhere else entirely, only using the room as a location. Someone introduced them. The handshake was brief. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes. Purely social architecture, a proof of contact with no actual content. Mick Jagger walked away thinking, he's shy, or performing shyness, one of the two. He did not revise the bet. Nevermind spent 16 weeks in the top 10. By spring 1992, it had sold 10 million copies. The music press did not move on. The audience did not move on. Mick Jagger followed this with professional attention and personal distance. He listened to the record again, properly, in his studio in Richmond, alone. He listened to it the way he listened to music he was trying to understand rather than enjoy. He understood it better the second time. The melodies, which he had dismissed as incidental, were actually quite strong. Wearing different clothes than melodies usually wore. The voice was doing something specific he had initially missed. The relationship between restraint and release, the way it held back in the verses and then let go in a way that felt involuntary, like something breaking rather than something performed. He still thought it would pass. He told himself this in the way you tell yourself things when you are beginning to suspect you might be wrong, but are not ready to acknowledge the suspicion. He met Kurt a second time in September 1992, backstage at a festival in Reading. The Stones were not playing. Mick Jagger was there as a guest, watching, something he did occasionally when he wanted to remember what stages looked like from the other side. Nirvana was headlining. He watched the set from the wings. He had not planned to. He had planned to leave before the headliner. He stayed for the entire set. It was not what he expected. There was no working of the crowd, no calculated escalation, no performance of enjoyment or connection. Kurt moved on stage the way he had stood at the wall at that Los Angeles event, present in location, somewhere else in attention, using the stage as a surface to do the thing on, rather than a platform to project from. And yet the crowd was enormous and completely held. Mick Jagger had performed for 50,000 people. He knew what it felt like when a crowd was being held, the specific quality of that attention, the pressure in the air. The crowd at Reading had that quality, generated without any of the usual mechanisms. No call and response, no between-song warmth. Very little of the theatrical infrastructure he had spent 30 years constructing. There was just the music, and the person making it, and 50,000 people who could not look away. He stood in the wings for 90 minutes and did not check his watch once. Afterward, in a backstage corridor, he nearly walked into Kurt. "Good show," Mick Jagger said. Kurt looked at him. A pause that lasted slightly too long. "Thanks," Kurt said, and walked past. No recognition of who he was talking to. No performance of gratitude, no attempt to make something of the moment. Mick Jagger stood in the corridor and watched him go. The 2 years elapsed. Kurt Cobain did not quit. In Utero was released in September 1993. Darker, more difficult, deliberately uncommercial in ways that made it more compelling rather than less. The music press wrote about it seriously. The audience followed. Mick Jagger had lost the bet. He paid without being reminded. You paid promptly, made no excuses, and moved on. But moving on was not entirely possible. He had been wrong about Nirvana in the specific way that people are wrong when they mistake unfamiliarity for insignificance. When they look at something that doesn't fit their existing categories and conclude that the problem is with the thing rather than with the categories. He had been thinking about this steadily, the way a musician thinks about a chord change that doesn't resolve the way it should. In February 1994, Mick Jagger was in New York. On the evening of the 14th, he found himself with 3 hours free. Someone mentioned that Nirvana was playing a small, unannounced acoustic set at a venue in the Village, a rehearsal open to a limited audience, or something in that category. Mick Jagger went. The venue held maybe 100 people. It was not full. He arrived after the set had started, stood near the back. The room was very quiet, quieter than a room with 100 people in it should have been. Kurt was on stage alone, just an acoustic guitar and a microphone, the stage lighting low and slightly blue. No band, no amplification beyond a single monitor. The guitar was not plugged in. The sound was entirely natural, wood and string in a room. And in the quiet, it carried further than it should have. Mick Jagger recognized the song after the first verse. He had heard it on the radio, in the context of the full band, with the drums and distortion. Stripped of all that, the structure was more visible. The melody, which the production had half buried, was fully audible now. Genuinely good, the kind of good that didn't depend on volume or context. He listened. And he was not comfortable. Not because the music was confrontational, but because it was asking for genuine attention rather than professional assessment. It was asking him to stop categorizing and simply listen. He had spent so long categorizing that simply listening felt like setting down a tool he had been holding for 30 years. He set it down. The third song was the one that did it. He could not have explained precisely why. The song was not technically superior to the others. The performance was not more polished. It was something in the specific combination of elements. The way the voice dropped at a particular moment, the way a chord resolved unexpectedly into something that felt both wrong and completely inevitable. The way the lyric arrived at its last line with a plainness that should have felt like anticlimax, and instead felt like the point. Something moved in Mick Jagger's chest, not the broad public emotion of a concert, the exhilaration of being part of a crowd responding to something great. Something smaller and more private, the feeling of being seen by music, which was different from being moved by it. The feeling that someone had said something true and specific in your direction, and that the truth of it made denial impossible. He thought involuntarily about the first records he had loved, before the Stones, before the stage presence was constructed, before the persona was assembled, before the understanding of what he was doing had become sophisticated enough to get between him and the doing of it. The records he had listened to in his bedroom in Dartford when he was 16, and music was not yet a career, but simply the most vivid language he had encountered. He had not thought about that in a long time. He thought about it now. Standing at the back of a room with 100 people who were all very still, watching a 26-year-old sit on a stage in New York in February with an unplugged guitar and mean every single word. Kurt played for 40 minutes. When it was over, the applause was genuine and slightly stunned. The way applause is when a room has been somewhere it didn't expect to go. Kurt nodded once at the audience, the same nod Mick Jagger had seen him give backstage at Reading, the nod that was not a bow, that communicated completion rather than gratitude, and walked off stage. Mick Jagger did not go backstage. He stood at the back of the room while the audience dispersed, and he thought about the bet, about the dinner in Mayfair, the casual confidence with which he had placed 10,000 pounds on the proposition that this would pass. He thought about being wrong, Not wrong about a fact, but structurally wrong, wrong at the level of the framework. He had thought the music was a reaction, a generational gesture that would exhaust itself when the thing it opposed either adapted or absorbed it. He had not understood that for Kurt Cobain, there was nothing to oppose. There was only the thing itself, the songs, the voice, the acoustic guitar in a quiet room, the attempt to say something true in the only language that had ever made sense to him. The anger in the records was not the source. It was a weather condition. The source was a person who could not be anything other than what he was, and who kept being it regardless of whether the room was full or empty. He walked out into the February cold. He told the story in pieces over the years. The bet came out first in a 1997 interview with a music journalist who was writing about the 90s and asked Jagger directly whether he had been wrong about grunge. Mick Jagger admitted the bet without apparent embarrassment, with the equanimity of someone who had lost gracefully enough that losing had become part of the story rather than a stain on it. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they decide they understand something they haven't actually looked at closely enough. I had an argument, and the argument was internally coherent, and it turned out the argument was answering the wrong question." The journalist asked what the right question was. Mick Jagger thought for a moment. "I was asking whether it would last," he said. "That was the wrong question. The right question was whether it was real. And it was. Whatever else you say about it, whatever you think about the music or the era or the culture around it, it was real." He meant it. That's rarer than it sounds. The February evening in the Village came out later, in a 2003 interview, almost as a footnote. He described it briefly. The small room, the acoustic guitar, the unplugged sound, the 40 minutes. He described standing at the back and listening. "I had written him off," Mick Jagger said. "And then I watched him in that room and I understood I had been writing off the wrong thing. I had been evaluating the package, the image, the era, the genre, all the things around the music. And the music itself, the actual thing, was something else. It was just a person telling the truth with a guitar. That's what it's always been, when it's anything at all." The journalist asked if he regretted not speaking to Kurt that night. Mick Jagger was quiet for a moment. "He died 2 months later," he said. The room held the silence. "I regret not going backstage. I had reasons not to. I didn't want to be the famous person who shows up after the show and makes it about himself. But there are things you could have said that weren't about yourself, that were just acknowledgement, recognition from one person to another. I didn't say them." He looked past the interviewer. "I had placed a bet that he wouldn't last. He didn't last, and it turned out the bet was the least interesting thing about either of us." The venue in the Village closed 2 years after that February evening. The building was converted into something else. The details varied depending on who told the story. The 100 people who were in that room dispersed into their lives, carrying different versions of what they had heard. But certain things held across all the versions. The blue stage lighting, the unplugged guitar, the 40 minutes, and somewhere near the back, a man who had been famous for 30 years and had seen everything the music industry had to offer, standing very still with his arms at his sides, not checking his watch, not thinking about the bet or the dinner in Mayfair, or the argument he had constructed about what music was supposed to be, just listening, the way he had listened at 16 in a bedroom in Dartford, before he knew that listening could become a career, and before a career could put distance between you and the thing you loved. Just listening, the way you listen when something is true and you are not yet ready to look away. The most expensive lessons are the ones we pay for twice, once in money and once in understanding. The first payment is easy. You write the check and it's finished. The second takes longer. It requires standing in the back of a room and letting something dismantle an argument you had believed in for years. It requires the honesty to recognize that being wrong at the level of the framework is different from being wrong about a fact, and that only the first kind of wrong actually teaches you anything.